everyone. So first things first is I'm going to put a link below, should be in your email too, of The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. You're going to watch the movie adaptation. It's going to take you 18 or 19 minutes and it's kind of slow to start with, but if you stick with it, I hope it pays off for you. It pays off for me. But you need to watch it in order to understand some of the connections that are going to be happening in what we're watching on Wednesday. And then on Friday, you guys are making me a compare and contrast between what we watched today, The Lottery, and Britney's new look, Wednesday. So be sure to pay attention. I'm going to talk a little bit about some themes here in a moment. So go watch Shirley Jackson's The Lottery right now. Okay, so you might have noticed we've been talking about a lot of fiction, and you might be wondering, why do we analyze so much fiction in college? Well, that's because writers respond to what's going on in society. For example, there was an uproar in the writers' community over the last presidential campaign, and writers responded in their stories. So we should ask what the author is trying to communicate and how he or she did it. This becomes a useful exercise to identify meaningful themes. And then the literary tools of diction, imagery, symbolism, etc., that the author used to reveal that theme. And the point is to learn to extract information and meaning from what we read. As citizens, this is crucial to the functioning of a polite society, where we can listen, we can understand hidden and implied messages from a speaker for their opinions. Essentially, it allows us to communicate efficiently and be critical of the information that is presented to us. I want you to be able to form your own ideas and to be able to back them up with outside sources, outside information, examples, and personal experiences. Not only should you be able to back them up, but you should be able to defend them with solid evidence. That's where those sources come in support, so that you can understand both sides of an argument and how it's being made and what other people have said to make your informed decision. So fiction's a lot easier to analyze and do this to than reality is, typically because we have a certain perspective and we have a lot of additional information, whereas we don't typically have that when we're just responding to people in general. So that is why we are doing this. And with that in mind, when we think about the lottery and as slow as it goes to that build up, how many of you guys expected the ending? Usually when we think of the lottery, we think of positive, we think of winning money, or there's something that's going to benefit us in this way. And if you hear chirping, my cat's in heat, I'm sorry. But instead, the lottery becomes you're the one who's going to be sacrificed for the betterment of everybody else. So it's kind of like Tessie becomes like the child in Omelas. She is the one that has to be sacrificed, and we understand that this happens every single year as the old man repeats how I've been in this lottery for this many years, being proud of the fact that he survived that by blind chance so many times. So what connections can we make about the lottery? If we think about realistically, we can connect to plenty of sacrifices that we've had throughout history, and that's actually one of the big responses that she's gotten from the story is either disbelief or anger or whatever it is that these types of things still happen. So what do we think that the story is trying to criticize about society? Well, it is showing us a very plain suburban life. This is why it seems so mundane and so boring. It's talking about the familiarity of normal everyday activities in a normal community. Everybody knows each other, and it's normal. People are very willing to step on somebody else, on each other, on their friends, on their family, in order to advance in some way or to get a little bit better. We've talked about these themes plenty of times before, and it is present here as well. They are willing to sacrifice their neighbors in order to have a better life. They all took the same chance. It also indicates the increasing lack of safety that we have in what used to be safe suburbia. You used to be able to let your kids go play in the front yard. You can't really do that anymore unless you want them to get kidnapped. And so it's showing that slow shift of what we used to believe with traditions and how it evolves into the world has changed too much to continue to behave the way we used to. There's also a lack of genuine care for each other, at how willing they're able to kill one another. I mean, they even hand rocks to her son and he throws them at her. The family throws them at her. Look at the way the kids responded when they all individually opened up their pieces of paper. Yes, it's not me. I'm not the one who's going to die. Very willing, because they are not the ones to die, able to sacrifice everybody else. And that's how that continues to keep going. If it's not me and it's somebody else, then this must be a good system. It won't be me until it's you. It's got to be somebody, right? And this is indicating how the family is broken. That's, again, one of those dystopic satirical elements, is the family is broken. They're pitting them against each other. And we keep seeing them mentioning change amongst each other as they're chatting and whatnot. So-and-so's done away with this town's done away with that. And the old man is that representation of tradition, how we should keep things the way they are just simply because those are the way that's always been done. Obviously, we cannot exist like that. We cannot stay stagnant when we have new information. We should be able to change and reform our opinions in the way we do things based on new information. That is how logic and sense works. That's how progress works. That's how we advance as people. That's how we both can be logical and empathetic at the same time and actually care for one another and make things better for more people, is by taking steps forward and questioning tradition and changing what needs to be changed, but still keeping the same. We should keep our core values the same, I would hope, like the core values of equality. We should all be treated equally, not let it get skewed to, well, these people deserve to have more because of these circumstances and these people do, or that somebody should have something extra and somebody else shouldn't. That's not equal opportunity in treatment. Not everybody has equal assets, and it's not the same thing. Anyways, I'm getting beyond what we're meant to be here for. So there's also some references to this idea of like World War II, when you demonize other people in order to make yourself the good guy. And, people patting themselves on the back because we did good. We stopped Hitler. We stopped all the Axis powers, those evil people. But really, the soldiers were just the people who were ordered to do these things for their country. And it's hard to kill somebody who you see as like yourself, who you see as human, as an individual, as somebody whose life is worth something. That is really hard to do, which is why we demonize and we separate ourselves from. And that's what they're doing in their communities. Yeah, they're tentatively friends and neighbors, but this is just what we have to do. And so, sorry, you're our sacrifice. You're no longer Tessie. You're our sacrifice. So it is commenting on some of those things as well. It is helping us come to terms with the horrible things we do as a society. And we do horrible things. Individuals do horrible things, societies do horrible things, communities do horrible things, governments do horrible things. It's just, we're human. We cannot be good all the time. That is not natural. And we have to both fight and understand. If we don't understand that we do those things, we definitely can't fight them and change them. So that is a lot of the point of bearing that tradition against itself. It's really funny, some of the responses that Shirley Jackson got from this. But I wanted to read, she actually wrote in her biography about what it was like to get the story published and her actual intent, her writer intent, versus societal's interpretation of it based on the society that she lived in. So I'm going to read this to you briefly and give you a couple of quotes of some of the letters that she got, and then I'll let you go and we'll move on to the next bit on Wednesday. Okay, so on the morning of June 26, 1948, I walked down to the post office in our little Vermont town to pick up the mail. I was quite casual about it, as I recall. I opened the box, took out a couple of bills and a letter or two, talked to the postmaster for a few minutes, and left, never supposing that it was the last time for months that I was to pick up the mail without an active feeling of panic. By the next week, I had to change my mailbox to the largest one in the post office, and casual conversation with the postmaster was out of the question because he wasn't speaking to me. June 26, 1948 was the day the New Yorker came out with a story of mine in it. It was not my first published story, nor my last, but I have been assured over and over that it has been the only story I've ever wrote or published. There would be people who would not forget my name. I had written the story 3 weeks before on a bright June morning when summer seemed to have come at last, with blue skies and warm sun and no heavenly signs to warn me that my morning's work was anything but just another story. The idea had come to me while I was pushing my daughter up the hill in her stroller. It was, as I say, a warm morning, and the hill was steep, and beside my daughter, the stroller held the day's groceries, and perhaps the effort of my last 50 yards up the hill might have put an edge to the story. At any rate, I had the idea fairly clearly in my mind when I put my daughter in her playpen and the frozen vegetables in the refrigerator, and, writing the story, I found that it went quickly and easily, moving from the beginning to the end without pause. As a matter of fact, when I read it over later, I decided that except one or two minor corrections, it needed no changes, and the story I finally typed up and sent off to my agent the next day was almost word for word the original draft. This, as any writer of stories can tell you, is not a usual thing. All I know is that when I came to read the story over, I felt strongly that I didn't want to fuss with it. I didn't think it was perfect, but I didn't want to fuss with it. It was, I thought, a serious, straightforward story, and I was pleased and a little surprised at the ease with which it had been written. I was reasonably proud of it, and hoped that my agent would sell it to some magazine, and I would get the gratification of seeing it in print. My agent did not care for the story, but, as she said in her note at the time, her job was to sell it, not to like it. She sent it at once to the New Yorker, and about a week after the story had been written, I received a telephone call from the fiction editor of the New Yorker. It was quite clear that he did not really care for the story either, but the New Yorker was going to buy it. He asked for one change, that the date mentioned in the story be changed to coincide with the date of the issue of the magazine in which the story would appear. And I said, of course. Then he asked, hesitantly, if I had any particular interpretation of my own for the story. Mr. Harold Ross, then the editor of the New Yorker, was not altogether sure that he understood the story, and wondered if I cared to enlarge upon its meaning. I said no. Mr. Ross, he said, thought that the story might be puzzling to some people, in case anyone telephoned the magazine, as sometimes happened, or wrote in asking about the story, was there anything in particular I wanted to say. No, I said, nothing in particular. It was just a story I wrote. I had no more preparation than that. I went on picking up the mail every morning, pushing my daughter up and down the hill in her stroller, anticipating pleasurably the check from the New Yorker, and shopping for groceries. The weather stayed nice, and I looked as though it was going to be a good summer. Then, June 26th, the New Yorker came out with my story. Things began mildly enough, with a note from a friend at the New Yorker. Your story has kicked up quite a fuss around the office, he wrote. I was flattered. It's nice to think that your friends notice what you write. Later that day, there was a call from one of the magazine's editors. They had had a couple of people phone in about my story, he said. And was there anything I particularly wanted to say, if there were any more calls? No, I said, nothing particular. Anything he chose to say was perfectly all right with me. It was just a story. I was further puzzled by the cryptic note from another friend. Heard a man talking about a story of yours on the bus this morning, she wrote. Very exciting. I wanted to tell him I knew the author, but after I heard what he was saying, I decided I'd better not. One of the most terrifying aspects of publishing stories and books is the realization that they are going to be read, and read by strangers. I have never fully realized this before, upon the thought of the millions and millions of people who were going to be uplifted and enriched by and delighted by the stories I wrote. It had simply never occurred to me that these millions and millions of people might be so far from being uplifted that they would sit down and write me letters. I was downright scared to open. Of the 300-odd letters that I received that summer, I can count only 13 that spoke kindly to me, and they were mostly from friends. Even my mother scolded me. Dad and I did not care at all for your story in the New Yorker, she wrote sternly. It does seem, dear, that this gloomy kind of story is what all you young people think about these days. Why don't you write something to cheer people up? By mid-July, I had begun to perceive that I was very lucky indeed to be safely in Vermont, where no one in our small town had ever heard of the New Yorker, much less read my story. Millions of people, and my mother, had taken a pronounced dislike to me. The magazine kept no track of phone calls, but all the letters addressed to the care of the magazine were forwarded directly to me for answering, and all letters addressed to the magazine, some of them addressed to Harold Ross personally, these were the most vehement, were answered at the magazine, and then the letters were sent in great batches, along with carbons of the answers written at the magazine. I have all the letters still, and if I could be considered to give any accurate cross-section of the reading public, or the reading public of the New Yorker, or even the reading public of one issue of the New Yorker, I would stop writing now. Judging from these letters, people who read the stories are gullible, rude, frequently illiterate, and horribly afraid of being laughed at. Many of the writers were positive that the New Yorker was going to ridicule them in print, and the most cautious letters were headed in the capital letters, not for publication, or please do not print this letter, or at best, this letter may be published at your usual rates of payment. Anonymous letters, of which there were a few, were destroyed. The New Yorker never published any comment of any kind about the story in the magazine, and did issue one publicity release saying that the story had received more mail than any piece of fiction that they had ever published. This was after newspapers had gotten into the act in midsummer, with a front-page story in the San Francisco Chronicle begging to know what the story meant, in a series of columns in New York and Chicago papers pointing out that the New Yorker subscriptions were being canceled right and left. Curiously, there are three main themes which dominate the letters of that first summer, three themes which might be identified as bewilderment, speculation, and plain old-fashioned abuse. In the years since, during which the story has been anthologized, dramatized, televised, and even in one completely mystifying transformation, made into a ballet, the tenor of the letters I received has changed. I am addressed more politely, as a rule. The letters largely confine themselves to questions like, what does the story mean? The general tone of easy letters, however, was a kind of wide-eyed shock innocent. People at first were not so much concerned with what the story meant. What they wanted to know was where these lotteries were held, and whether they could go there and watch. Listen to these quotations. Kansas. Will you please tell me the locale and the year of the custom? Oregon. Where in heaven's name does there exist such barbarity as described in this story? New York. Do such tribunal rituals still exist, and if so, where? New York. To a reader who has only fleeting knowledge of traditional rites in the various parts of the country, I presume the plot was laid in the United States. I found the cruelty of the ceremony outrageous, if not unbelievable. It may be just a custom or ritual which I am not familiar with. And there are columns and columns of questions similar to this, my favorite of which, England. I am sorry that I cannot find out the state in which this annual sacrifice takes place. Now I just frankly don't believe that even in the United States such things happen. At least not without being sponsored by Lynching Inc., or the All-American Morticians Group, or some such high-powered organization. I was once offered a baby by a primitive tribe in the center of Laos, which my interpreter informed me I had to kill so that my bloodlust was satiated, and I would leave the rest of the tribe alone, but not in the United States. Please. The second major theme that dominates the letters is what I call speculation. These letters were from the people who sat down and figured out the meaning of the story or the reason for writing it, and wrote it proudly to explain, or else wrote in to explain why they could not possibly believe the story had any meaning at all. New Jersey. Surely it is only a bad dream the author had. New York. Was it meant to be taken seriously? New York. Was the sole purpose just to give the reader a nasty impact? California. The main idea which has been evolved is that the author has tried to challenge the logic of our society's realizing its aggressions through the channel of minority prejudice by presenting an equally logical, or possibly more logical, method of selecting a scapegoat. The complete horror of the cold-blooded method of choosing a victim parallels our own culture's devices for handling deep-seated hostilities. New York. Is this a publicity stunt? New Orleans. I wish Mrs. Hutcherson had been queen for a day or something nice like that, before they stoned the poor frightened creature. New York. Were you saying that people will accept any evil as long as it doesn't touch them personally? Maine. I suppose that, about once every so often, a magazine may decide to print something that hasn't any point, just to get people talking. In Indiana. When I first read the story in my issue, I felt that there was no moral significance present, that the story was just terrifying, and that was all. However, there has to be a reason why it was so alarming to so many people. I feel that the only solution, the only reason it bothered so many people, is that it shows the power of society over the individual. We saw the ease with which society can crush any single one of us. At the same time, we saw that society need have no rational reason for crushing the one, or the few, or sometimes the many. You see some of these interpretations I was just talking about? Alright. And far and away, the most empathetic letter writers were those who took this opportunity of indulging themselves in good old-fashioned name-calling. I'm only going to read some of their comments. Canada. Tell Miss Jackson to stay out of Canada. New York. I expect a personal apology from the author. Massachusetts. I think I had better switch to the Saturday Evening Post. Massachusetts. I will never buy the New Yorker again. I resent being tricked into reading perverted stories like The Lottery. Minnesota. Never in the world did I think I'd protest a story in the New Yorker. But really, gentlemen, The Lottery seems to me to be in incredibly bad taste. I read it while soaking in the tub and attempted to put my head under the water and end it all. California. I'm glad that your magazine does not have the popular and foreign language circulation of the Reader's Digest. Such a story might make German, Russian, and Japanese realists feel lily white in comparison with the American. The old saying of washing dirty linen in public has gone out of fashion with us. At any rate, this story has reconciled me to not receiving your magazine next year. Or my favorite, and I'm sorry, it's the longest one. Sir, thanks for letting us take a look at the nauseating and fictionless bit of print which appeared in the recent issue. I gather that we read the literal translation. The process of moving set us back a few weeks, but unfortunately your magazine and Miss Jackson's consistently correct spelling and punctuation caught up with us. We are pleased to think that perhaps her story recalled happier days for you. Days when you were able to hurl flat, skipping stones at your aged grandmother. Not for any particular reason, of course, but because the village postmaster good-naturedly placed them in your hands, or because your chubby fingers felt good as they gripped the stone. Our quarrel is not with Miss Jackson's amazingly clear style, reportorial observation. It is not with the strong motives exhibited by the native stone-throwers, or with the undertones and overtones which apparently we missed along the way. It is simply, we read the piece before, not after, supper. We are hammering together a few paragraphs on running the head of our kindly neighbor through the electric egg beater, and will mail same when we have untangled her top piece. This should give your many readers a low chuckle, or at least provide the sophisticates with an inner glow. Also, it might interest you to know that my wife and I are gathering up the smoothest, roundest stones in our yard and piling them up in the corner in small, neat pyramids. We're sentimentalists that way. So, as you can see, her response to people's responses is quite abnormal to what we typically think of when we think of analyzing fiction. Usually, we think that an author goes in with an intent, but often we find that just circumstances and life as we know it and juxtaposing certain ideas for an author can read wildly different to a lot of different people, and reading responses are important responses, which is also why we find that people who read fiction and are impacted by fiction often replicate it or reproduce it or make it their own in some way, steal pieces, create satire over it, or parodies of it, much like South Park likes to do. Which is why you will see in South Park in our next class that they actually have the characters drawn like the ones from the reproduction that we see of Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. So keep those things in mind as we move into the next. Be sure that you are taking notes because you're going to have to compare and contrast on Friday. So, alright, I'm done babbling. I will see you guys next time.